Hi, welcome to Morning with Meep, and today I'm talking about a book I recently finished called The Poisoner's Handbook. The subtitle is Murder and the Birth of Forensic Medicine in Jazz Age New York. Like many nonfiction books that I've read recently, the main title, The Poisoner's Handbook, is somewhat misleading and intended to catch your eye, and the subtitle is really what it's about. And it's not only about murder. This is really interesting, and there was a documentary made of this, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's take a look at the table of contents. This is from the Kindle version, but this is pretty much how it goes. You see, it goes poison by poison in order: chloroform, wood alcohol, methanol or methyl alcohol, cyanides, arsenic, mercury, carbon monoxide, carbon monoxide part 1, methyl alcohol, which is the same as wood alcohol. Anyway, radium, ethyl alcohol, carbon monoxide, and thallium. So you can see there are years next to each of these. It's pretty much going in chronological order, but what the book is really about is two men, Charles Norris, the original Chuck Norris. No, there was absolutely no way anybody called this man Chuck. Charles Norris, who started the medical examiner system in New York City, and the main man he hired, Alexander Gettler, who was a chemist that he used because, of course, Charles Norris was a doctor, a medical doctor, and Gettler knew the chemistry that Gettler was the one who came up with tests to try to detect some of these poisons that you see in this table of contents. Because the issue with a lot of these is, how do you prove that somebody was poisoned? In some of these cases, it's accidental. It wasn't murder. And that's part of what's going on in this book. There's a little bit of mystery in some of these cases. In some of these cases, it's a little unresolved in that you're not quite sure what happened, though in basically most of the juiciest ones, you absolutely do find out. One of the ones, I'm sorry, and it's probably the carbon monoxide chapter involved, I could say life insurance fraud, but no, it's murder for life insurance benefits. And that's not that unusual history. We haven't had too many of them recently, but it still occurs. No, the murderers don't get the money if they're convicted of murder, so don't worry about that. I'm not going to dig into that today. So part of the book is following the history of Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler, and a lot of it is Alexander Gettler and the challenges he has in proving that someone was killed in a particular manner, whether it was murder or accident or whatever. So you've got kind of that mystery aspect. But one of the big parts is the politics, the literal politics, not scientific politics or medical politics, but real politics. There was also, as I mentioned, a documentary. So for PBS, The American Experience, they had a show, The Poisoner's Handbook. So if you don't have the time to go through the book, I do recommend this. They do capture all the juiciest cases in the Poisoner's Handbook doc, and in a couple of cases, they do go through, and in all of these, like, how does that poison kill a human being, number one. But there are details that are left out of the documentary that are in the book, such as some of the experiments Gettler or his assistants performed to try to prove kind of how much trace of a poison would exist in the system after you die. And as you can imagine, the way they tested that out is pretty horrific. So I'm not going to tell you about it. You can read the book, but if you'd rather not have the gory details, you can go into the Poisoner's Handbook documentary. But they do mention actually some of it. A lot of the issues, though, were just really literal politics. Before Charles Norris really set up this chief medical examiner's office in New York City. You had coroner's offices, and as in the politics of New York City at the time, the machine politics, like Tammany Hall, got people in these positions which they used for their financial benefit. So the kinds of people who might be the coroners, who would sign the death certificates, were also undertakers who ran funeral homes. And no, I'm not going to give you this death certificate unless you use the services of my company, for example. There are kickbacks. In some cases, families, you outright bribe the coroners to give a particular death certificate so you could get the life insurance benefits. And there's two cases of that in terms of there were suicide exclusions for obvious reasons on life insurance. It's changed somewhat since then, but I'm not describing that now either. And so they'd want a death certificate that didn't say suicide, for example. But another one is there are riders or different kinds of insurance called AD&D, accidental death and dismemberment, which has to do with accidental deaths. And so, maybe it would be a little extra boost off of, up and over the regular death benefits. So if the death certificate came in saying an accidental death, even though, like, say it was a heart attack, but you're like, oh, he was run over by a car, it was accidental death. So then you would get extra money. So the coroner wanted a piece of the action. It does get in, and I don't remember all the politics, so you can see how important that was. No, but at a high level, Charles Norris had to fight every step of the way to get his office established, to make sure it was properly resourced. One aspect, and I don't believe this was in the TV show, but is definitely in the book, where he is fighting for budget so that this office, and this got established, let's take a look, in like 1918, so around World War I, cars were kind of new, ownership wasn't widespread, and they wanted their office to own its own vehicles so that they could get to a death scene rapidly enough so that they could, accumulate evidence. The longer it took them to get to the scene, of course, you start having evidence degrade and that kind of thing. And some of it was making sure the people who worked in the office were compensated enough. One of the aspects, and this is not that unusual in the 19th century into the early 20th century, Charles Norris paid for some of the expenses of the office right out of his own pocket. He came from a fairly well-to-do family. I believe his father was a lawyer. He had been a professor himself at, I think, Columbia. He had independent means, independent of this office. He was not dependent on this office for his living, but a lot of the people who worked for him were dependent on that. So, that's something to consider. The battling between Charles Norris and various mayors and other political machines is throughout the book, and it's a lot more interesting than you may think. But finally, I'm going to move from nonfiction to fiction and mention a link to Murdoch Mysteries. Some of you guys may have already seen Murdoch Mysteries. It's an ongoing Canadian TV show. As it's mainly murder mysteries. Most mystery shows are mainly murder mysteries. And it's set kind of in late Victorian Edwardian period in Toronto. Murdoch, so this guy right here, he's the main character. He's the main detective. He's Roman Catholic, and there's some interesting aspects that come out of that. But he's basically similar to, I wouldn't say Charles Norris because he's not a doctor. She is. He is more like Alexander Gettler, but he's actually a police detective, so he's not even that. But he's kind of an inventor. He knows chemistry. He knows, the state-of-the-art electricity. There's a lot of anachronisms, by the way, in the show, but that's okay. You can let it go. But some of the stories, which were real life, obviously Poisoner's Handbook is based on real life history and some pretty notorious cases in New York City. some of the plot lines. So, for example, there's a story of a family that got poisoned by thallium, which is a radioactive substance. I believe it was the radioactivity that kills in thallium, but I could be wrong. So it was a case where, like, all the children died and the wife died, and of course the husband is, um, I mean, he's going to get arrested. He's going to get charged with the murder. I'm not going to tell you how it works out, and the way things work out in Murdoch Mysteries, and as I said, it's ongoing. Started in 2008. They're still making episodes. The way things resolve in Murdoch Mysteries is not always the way it had turned out in real life, which is fine. This is set in a different country. It's kind of steampunkish and anachronisms in technology. Some of them are really funny. One of the episodes has a character being shot off in a rocket. I don't want to get into that. My favorite episode, and this is actually more, Stuart watches this much more than I do, but he knows what kinds of episodes I like. And there's one episode that's basically a convention of inventors. And Murdoch himself invents things, but you get historical characters like Alexander Graham Bell showing up, and other associated real-life people like Tesla, Mark Twain, people like that of that era. Don't look too closely at the history, but many are inspired by things that did actually happen, even though, of course, it's twisted for dramatic effect. Anyway, I thought it was a fun book. A lot of people complained. Like, if you read, and I'm not going to scroll down to the reviews, I read the reviews after I read the book. I actually watched the documentary first, then I read the book. Then I looked at the reviews, and some people were complaining, well, this isn't really a poisoner's handbook. It's just like, well, the publisher is getting you by a somewhat deceptive title. It does go down poisoners, but it's really about Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler and the work they did to build up credibility for a chief medical examiner's office. They set just best practices, best in class, and inspired medical examiner offices throughout the U.S. so that by World War II and after World War II, this was a professional office. And of course, you don't want you might have political appointees, but you want competent people who are not getting kickbacks. And they also built up the science of how do you detect arsenic poisoning, cyanide, carbon monoxide. What do the bodies look like? What are some of the signs of poisoning? And some of these, were about improving public safety, not about murder. I thought it was really interesting. I really like these kinds of what I call specialized histories, where you just take a niche and you follow it chronologically, and this is over a fairly 20-year period, I think, that they follow it. So I thought it was really interesting. It moves, the pacing is good. You get the salacious along with the scientific. So it's nice to have a little bit of everything. So enjoy.